Hey, fourth grade, we are back at it again with Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, chapters 11 and 12 today. To recap, yesterday we read about Mrs. Frisby going to the rose bush to find the rats, and she met Mr. Ages coming in as she was being turned away by Brutus, and so she went back and found Justin, and now he's taking her into their area. In the library. The tunnel led gently downward, and after the first dozen steps they were in darkness. Mrs. Frisby could see nothing at all. Behind her, Mr. Ages limped along. Ahead, she could hear the scuffle of Justin's footsteps. She followed the sound blindly. Then she heard his voice. "Just walk straight forward, Mrs. Frisby. There's nothing to trip over and nothing to bump into. If you get off course, you'll feel the wall," he added. "The dark part doesn't last long." Now, what did he mean by that? She thought it over for a minute or two as she walked, and had just decided to ask him when, to her surprise, she saw ahead of her a faint glow. A light. But how could there be a light down so far? "There, we're through it," said Justin cheerfully. "I know that blackout bit must be annoying the first time, but it's necessary." "But aren't we underground?" "Oh, yes, about 3 feet down by now, I'd guess." "Then how can it be light?" "I could tell you," Justin said, "but if you'll wait 15 seconds, you'll see for yourself." In a few more steps, the tunnel, Mrs. Frisby could now discern dimly its shape and direction, took a turn to the right, and she did see for herself. She stopped in astonishment. Ahead of her stretched a long, well-lit hallway. Its ceiling and walls were a smoothly curved arch, its floor hard and flat, and a soft layer of carpet down in the middle. The light came from the walls, where every foot or so on both sides a tiny light bulb had been recessed in the hole in which it stood, like a small window, had been covered with a square of colored glass, blue, green, or yellow, the effect of that stained glass window in sunlight. Justin was watching her and smiling. "Do you like it? The carpet and the colored glass we don't really need. Some of the wives did that on their own, just for looks. They cut the glass, and believe it or not, from old bottles. The carpet was a piece of trim they found somewhere." "It's beautiful," Mrs. Frisby said. "But how?" "We've had electricity for 4 years now." "5," said Mr. Ages. "5," said Justin agreeably. "The lights, they were the very small, very bright, twinkling kind we found on trees. In fact, most of our lights come from trees. Not until after Christmas, of course, about New Year's. The big light bulbs we had trouble handling." Mrs. Frisby was familiar with electricity. Her husband, who knew all kinds of things, had once explained it to her. At night she had seen the lamps shining in Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, and at Christmas time the lights that his son strung up on a pine tree outside. "You mean you just took them?" she asked. "We were careful to only take a few from each tree," said Mr. Ages. "It was like picking fruit," Justin said rather dreamily. "The annual light bulb harvest. We had to go quite far up the road before we had enough. Even so, it took 2 Christmases." "Justin," said Mr. Ages, "I think we'd better get on." They continued along the corridor, which curved always slightly to the right, so Mrs. Frisby could never really tell how long it was, and which she began to notice inclined more steeply into the ground. Mrs. Frisby noticed that the air, which should have been dank and damp, so deep underground, was on the contrary fresh and clean. She thought she could even detect a very faint breeze blowing past her ears as she moved. In a few more minutes the hall widened abruptly into the large oval chamber. Here the lights were set in the ceiling. At the far end Mrs. Frisby could see the long tunnel continued, and looked as if it slanted upward again. Perhaps another entrance, a back door? Was this, then, their destination, the main hall of the rats? But if so, where were all the rats? The room was entirely empty, not even a stick of furniture. "A storeroom," said Justin, "sometimes full, now empty." Then she saw off on one side of the chamber there was a stairway leading down, and beside it a small door. Justin led them to the door. "For freight only," he said with a grin at Mr. Ages. "But considering your limp, I think we can make an exception. The stairs wouldn't be easy." Mrs. Frisby looked at the stairway. It went down in a spiral. Each step was neatly inlaid with a rectangular piece of slate. She could not tell how far down it led, since after the first turn of the spiral she could see no more. But she had a feeling it was a long way down. As Justin said, it would be hard for Mr. Ages. Justin opened the door, and it led to a square room that looked like a closet. "After you," he said. Mrs. Frisby went in, and the others followed, and the door swung shut. On the wall there were 2 knobs. Justin pushed one of them, and Mrs. Frisby, who had never been in an elevator before, gasped and almost fell as she felt the floor suddenly sink beneath her feet. Justin reached out a hand to steady her. There they are in the elevator. "It's all right," he said. "I should have warned you." "But we're falling." "Not quite. We're going down, but we've got 2 strong cables and an electric motor holding us." Still, Mrs. Frisby held her breath during the rest of the descent until finally the small elevator came to a gentle stop and Justin opened the door. Then she breathed again and looked out. The room before her was at least 3 times as big as the one they had left, and corridors radiated from it as in many directions as petals from a daisy. Directly opposite the elevator, an open arch led into what looked like a still larger room, seemingly what kind of an assembly hall, for it had raised platform on one end. And now there were the rats. Rats by dozens, rats standing and talking in groups of 2s and 3s and 4s, rats walking slowly, rats hurrying, rats carrying papers. As Mrs. Frisby stepped from the elevator, it became obvious that the strangers were a rarity down there, for the hubbub of a dozen conversations stopped abruptly, and all heads turned to look at her. They did not look hostile, nor were they alarmed, since her 2 companions were familiar to them, but merely curious. Then, as quickly as it had died out, the sound of talking began again, as if the rats were too polite to stand and stare. But one of them, a lean rat with a scarred face, left his group and walked toward them. "Justin, Mr. Ages, I see we have a guest." He spoke graciously, with an air of quiet dignity, and Mrs. Frisby noticed 2 more things about him. First, the scar on his face ran across his left eye, and over his eye he wore a black patch, fastened by a cord around his head. Second, he carried a satchel, rather like a handbag, by the strap over his shoulder. "A guest whose name you will recognize," said Justin. "She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. Mrs. Frisby, this is Nicodemus." "A name I recognize, indeed," said the rat, as he called Nicodemus. "Mrs. Frisby, are you perhaps aware of this? Your late husband was one of our greatest friends. You are welcome here." "Thank you," said Mrs. Frisby, but she was more puzzled than ever. "In fact, I did not know that you knew my husband, but I'm glad to hear it because I've come to ask your help." "Mrs. Frisby has a problem," said Mr. Ages, "an urgent one." "If we can help you, we will," said Nicodemus. He asked Mr. Ages, "Can it wait until after the meeting? An hour? We're just ready to begin again." Mr. Ages considered. "An hour will make no difference, I think." Nicodemus said, "Justin, show Mrs. Frisby to the library where she can be comfortable until the meeting is over." By this time, the last of the other assembled rats had made their way into a large meeting hall, where they sat facing the raised platform. Nicodemus followed them, pulling some papers and a small reading glass from his satchel at his side, and walked to the front of the room. Justin led Mrs. Frisby in another direction, down the corridor to their left. Again, she had an impression of a faint, cool breeze against her face. She realized that the corridor she had walked in up above was merely a long entranceway, and that the hallways around her were the rats' real living quarters. The one down which Justin led her was lined with doors, one of which he opened. "In here," he said. The room they entered was big, square, well lit, and had a faint, musty smell. "It's reasonably comfortable, and if you like to read," he gestured at the walls. They were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. On the shelves stood Mrs. Frisby, dredged in her memory. "Books," she said. "They're books." "Yes," said Justin. "Do you read much?" "Only a little," said Mrs. Frisby. "My husband taught me and the children." She started to tell him how, laboriously scratching letters in the earth with a stick. It seemed so long ago. But Justin was leaving. "Excuse me, I've got to go to the meeting. I hate meetings, but this one's important. We're finishing up the schedule for the plan." He pronounced it with a capital P. "The plan?" But he was out the door, closing it gently behind him. Mrs. Frisby looked around her. The room, the library Nicodemus had called it, had, in addition to its shelves of books, several tables with benches beside them, and on these were stacked with more books, some of them open. Books. Her husband Jonathan had told her about them. He had taught her and the children to read. The children had mastered it quickly, but she herself could barely manage the simplest words. She had thought perhaps it was because she was older. He had told her about electricity, and he had known these things, and so, it emerged, did the rats. It never occurred to her until now to wonder how he knew them. He had always known so many things, and she had accepted that as a matter of course. But who had taught him to read? Strangely, it had emerged that he had also known the rats. Had they taught him? What had been his connection with them? She remembered long visits with Mr. Ages, and Mr. Ages knew the rats too. She sighed. Perhaps when the meeting was over and she had a chance to talk to Nicodemus and had told him about Timothy and moving day, perhaps when that was settled, he could explain all this to her. She noticed at the far end of the room a section of wall where there were no bookshelves. There were instead a blackboard covered with words and numbers written in white chalk. There were pieces of chalk and an eraser in the rack at the bottom of it. The blackboard stood near the end of the longest of the tables. Was the library also used as a classroom? Then she looked at the blackboard, and rather laboriously read what was written on it, and she saw that it was not. It was rather a conference room. At the top of the board, in large letters, were printed the words, "The Plan of the Rats of NIM." Chapter 12. Isabella. Mrs. Frisby spelled it out slowly. The Plan of the Rats of NIM. What or where was NIM? The name had a strange and far-away sound. Had the rats then come here from some place else? Did that explain why they had books and electric lights and wires and electric motor? Yet they had been here, or at least there had been rats here for as long as she could remember. Still, that was not so very long. She wondered what other things they had. Suddenly, she had almost overwhelming desire to look around, to see what was behind the other doors and down the other corridors. She went to the door, opened it, and looked out into the hall. It was entirely deserted and silent, except that when she listened carefully, she could hear a faint humming in the distance, as if something were running. Another motor? She started out into the hall, and then changed her mind. Better not. Nicodemus had been friendly. They'd all been friendly, but explicit. He had said that she was to wait in the library. She was not there to pry, but to get help. She went back into the library, closed the door, and sat on one of the benches. The books on the table were mostly paperbacks, small enough so that the rats could handle them easily enough, but not too big for her. So she sat in front of the blackboard and looked at it again. Beneath the title, across the top, in neatly chalked handwriting, were columns and words and figures. Schedule. January, Group 1 of 10. Oats, 30 loads equals 2 bushels. Group 2, 10. Wheat, 30 loads equals 2 bushels. Group 3, 10. Corn, 20 loads equals 1.5 bushels. Group 4, 10. Miscellaneous seeds, estimated 10 loads total. Here's the schedule. The rest of the blackboard was filled with more rows of figures, each held by the name of a month: February, March, April, May, and so on through July. At the bottom, a separate square was ruled off. Plows, Arthur's group, 14. Plow number 2, complete, January 1. Plow number 3, complete, February 10. Plow number 4, complete, March 20. Mrs. Frisby stared at all this, trying to make heads or tails of it, but she could not. It was quite incomprehensible. She was still puzzling over it when the door opened and a rat came in. It was a girl rat, small and quite young, judging by her looks. She was carrying a pencil and some papers and looked at the papers as she walked, so she did not see Mrs. Frisby at first. When she did, she gasped and almost dropped the papers, scattering them on the floor. Her eyes opened wide. "Who are you?" she asked. "I don't know you. How did you get in?" She backed toward the door. "It's all right," said Mrs. Frisby. "I'm a friend of Mr. Age's." The rat was indeed young, only a child. "But why are you in here? Who let you in?" "Nicodemus. He told me to wait here." The girl rat looked doubtful. "You might be a spy." "A spy? How could I be? A spy from where?" "I don't know. From outside. Maybe from NIM." "I don't even know what NIM is." "That's what you say." "But I don't. What is it?" asked Mrs. Frisby, feeling slightly annoyed. "It's a place." The girl rat, her alarm apparently subsiding, began picking up her scattered papers. "I'm supposed to be practicing my reading." "What kind of place?" "It's where we came from. I don't know too much about it. I've never been there." "How come you come here? How can you come from there if you've never been there?" "My father and mother did. I was born afterward. I think it's white. Anyway, I know one thing. We don't want to go back, and we don't want to get caught." So Mrs. Frisby thought, that sounds as if whatever NIM was, the rats had escaped from it to come here. But she realized that she was not likely to get very clear information from such a child, and again she hoped that Nicodemus would explain it. "Did Nicodemus come from NIM too?" "Yes." "And Justin?" "Yes." "You know Justin?" "Yes." "I guess you're not a spy," said the rat girl. She sounded mildly disappointed. Then she added irrelevantly, "Justin's not married." She climbed on one of the benches and opened a book. "He's the best one of all. He's not even afraid of dragon." She read in the book for perhaps 30 seconds, picked up her pencil, and then put it down again. "I'm too young to get married." "I suppose so," said Mrs. Frisby. "For a while yet. But that won't last long." "That's what my mother says, but it seems long. And Justin might marry somebody else." "Maybe not," said Mrs. Frisby, who could see beyond the tip of her nose. "He's pretty young himself yet. What's your name?" Isabella, that's a pretty name. It's all right. My brother calls me Izzy. I don't like that. I don't wonder. Where's your brother? At the meeting. He's older. All the men are at the meeting, but my mother didn't go. The mothers always don't go. She's in the grain room packing grain. Packing grain? For the plan. She doesn't like the plan, though. The plan again. What is the plan? Why doesn't she like it? It's just the plan. It's where we're going to live and all that. She doesn't like it because she says it's too hard and no more electric lights and no more refrigerator and no more running water. But she isn't deserting or anything. Not like Jenner. We didn't like Jenner. Who's Jenner? He was in the group, but he quit. Maybe he went back to NIM. We don't know. Mrs. Frisby was gradually getting a picture of life in the rat colony, a somewhat confusing one because Isabel was a child, but nonetheless certain things were apparent. They had a grain room, presumably for food storage. The females sometimes went to meetings, but sometimes not. Nicodemus seemed to be the leader. They had a plan for the future that some rats did not like, and one, named Jenner, had deserted. Or the others had gone with him? She was about to ask Isabella when the library door opened, and Nicodemus, Justin, and Mr. Ages entered. Another rat came with them, a stranger.